Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson. We recently had an episode where I talked about a really common condition that not a lot of people know about. It's called NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And it's a condition that's tightly associated with another condition that we've had multiple episodes on called metabolic syndrome, where there's an increased amount of visceral adipose tissue, belly fat. The waist circumference is elevated, let's say. There's usually elevated triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, high blood sugar, and high blood pressure. And all it takes is 3 out of the 5 of those conditions or symptoms to have the diagnosis of metabolic syndrome. And we know that NAFLD is associated with that. And there's kind of a common denominator between all these things. There's probably a few common denominators, but the one that I'm going to mention today is hyperinsulinemia. We talked about insulin many times because insulin is kind of the hormonal kind of association with obesity. And with obesity, we have increased risk factor for diabetes and then a whole host of other kind of cardiometabolic issues like heart disease and diabetes and these kind of things, blood sugar dysregulation. And so NAFLD is a condition where there's an accumulation of fat in the liver. And the reason why that happens is because as blood sugar accumulates in the system, the liver works really hard to get that excess amount of blood sugar out of the bloodstream, because the body knows that excessive amount of blood sugar is very toxic to the body. It's very inflammatory for the body. So what the body would rather do is convert some of that blood sugar into triglycerides or into fat. And as those cells get so bombarded by excess amount of blood sugar, fat accumulates and accumulates and accumulates in the liver. The body is also, shunting some of this fat into our fat cells, and this is what is at the root of a lot of people accumulating excess amount of body fat, but it gets packed around the liver. And when it gets packed around the liver, that causes the liver to dysfunction. And one of the things that causes the liver to dysfunction, or one of the end results of this type of dysfunction, is insulin resistance. The liver starts to become resistant to insulin. The cells are so packed with sugar and with fat that insulin, which is supposed to kind of open the cell and allow more glucose to go in, the key goes in the lock, but the room is full. It just can't accept any more glucose. And so we've talked about NAFLD and these associations. And I've also mentioned that it's a condition that not a lot of people know about, but you should, because it significantly increases your risk factor for developing these very serious conditions. But there's even a lesser known condition that I want to talk about for a sec today. It's called, instead of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, it's NAFPD. It's non-alcoholic fatty pancreas disease. And so for many of the same reasons why NAFLD arises, same thing with NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty pancreas disease. So fat can accumulate around the pancreas, and this has kind of a whole different problem. And what the problem is, when fat accumulates around the pancreas, and just to remind you, the pancreas is where insulin is produced. And insulin, remember, has a key job of trying to bring down blood sugar in the body. When fat accumulates around the pancreas, kind of a different problem happens. The cells that produce insulin start to hypersecrete insulin. When fat gets all packed into these, it's called the islet cells. When they get packed into these islet cells, it causes excessive production of insulin. So then you have two problems. You have the liver with insulin resistance, and then you have the pancreas secreting excessive amounts of insulin. So you have like a double whammy of hyperinsulinemia. Hyperinsulinemia means too much insulin in the blood. And when you have too much insulin in the blood, first of all, we talked about it's inflammatory, and it kind of gums up different problems of the body, systems of the body, including the circulatory system. But it also increases our risk factor of more fat accumulation and more diabetes. And so some researchers wanted to investigate what they could do about this. What can we do to manage non-alcoholic fatty pancreas disease? And so some researchers out of the German Center for Diabetes did a study, and they published it just recently in a scientific journal called Metabolism. And here's what they did, is they took two groups. This was an animal study. So they took two groups of animals that were genetically designed to develop diabetes. So they have all different types of animals that they use for studies, and they can genetically engineer these animals to produce a certain disease, and then they apply a certain treatment to see if it helps to mitigate the process of that disease. And so that's what they did, and these animals were genetically designed to develop diabetes and its associated condition, obesity. And so they split into two groups. One group was allowed to eat what they call ad libitum. Ad libitum just means that they could eat however much whenever they want. Okay, that's one set of mice. I think it's either mice or rats. And then the other set of rodents were allowed to eat normally, kind of normal rat chow on one day, and the next day they fasted. So we call this alternating 24-hour intermittent fasting. So every other day they fasted, and the length of the study was 5 weeks. And here's what they determined. The animals that were, again, they're genetically programmed to develop diabetes and obesity. The ones that were able to eat as much as they wanted got obese, and they developed diabetes. And for the purpose of the study, they had really significant accumulation of fat packed all inside their pancreas. And then the animals that were in part of the study where they did alternating 24-hour fasts, they had very, very low accumulation of pancreatic fat. And as you would think, what happened was they didn't produce the excessive amount of insulin that the animals that were allowed to eat ad libitum, they produced this hyperinsulinemia, and the animals that did this intermittent fasting for 5 weeks had normal amounts of insulin. So these are animals that are genetically predisposed. So a lot of people, when they develop a health condition, they go, oh, this runs in my family, it's just genetic, you know. And the subtext is that there's nothing I could have done about this. And what we now know, that even if you have a genetic predisposition for obesity or diabetes, there are management strategies that we can consider. You might have to do things that are different from people who don't have this genetic predisposition, but it's very important to realize that even if you're genetically predisposed to something, that you're not destined to have that condition, and especially if it's a kind of a chronic condition like diabetes or obesity or heart disease, that you have to, you know, definitely succumb to this kind of slow process of kind of chronically making you ill the rest of your life. There's strategies. And this is a really great kind of first study that really dug into the connection between using intermittent fasting as a management tool and looking at NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty pancreas disease. So this condition that I think we're gonna hear more and more about, and the implications of it. But, you know, I just wanted to simplify it that NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, leads to insulin resistance, and non-alcoholic fatty pancreas disease leads to an excess amount of insulin. Excessive amounts of insulin from both of these organ systems is the net effect, and that causes fat accumulation and diabetes. And what this study showed is that, especially if you have got a genetic predisposition, there's some treatment strategies that could really help to mitigate the process of this condition. So intermittent fasting, and how cool is that? It's very easy to implement. It's low cost. It's actually no cost. In fact, it'll save you money because it doesn't cost anything, and you're not actually buying food on that day. And then also, it's a way to significantly mitigate a serious condition without any drugs at all. So it's an interesting study that was just published. I will keep reading you the studies and bringing you the information. Until then, keep it real.